Participants. Yes. So let's start then. It's already a huge event. Well, welcome to the CAMRI International Webinar on Decolonizing the Curriculum. The questions after that is which curriculum, how, and by whom, and that gives you an idea about what we are going to be discussing today. We have a full program for tonight's webinar and a great number of speakers. They will be presenting, hopefully unsettling and engaging in discussion. The discussion will follow their presentations. So in the form of a very brief introduction about the webinar, a critique of the hegemonic underpinnings of the university curriculum, which has been structured by coloniality and mobilized to sustain colonial empires, initially started with the Rhodes Must Fall movement and was originally aiming at the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town. The statue itself represented for students and staff activists the inherent structural inequalities and injustices of the colonial era. The campaign led to a much wider movement to decolonize education across South Africa and also elsewhere in the world. The calls for equity and the removal of structural imbalances, both in and outside the academy, continued with the Black Lives Matter protests, which in their own turn mounted a further challenge to white-centric voices and academic coloniality. The movement has been too important and in a way too successful for its own good, which quite often is the case with the history of movements. What started as a radical and well-intentioned movement is now perhaps in danger of being semantically stabilized by the very institution it is aimed at, the university. It has become part of the newspeak that is readily regurgitated by university managers, educational strategists, and policymakers across the world. The webinar tonight aims to be an intervention that will not only raise questions around the certainties of the university curriculum, a current and urgent both epistemologically and politically debate, but will also, we hope, move beyond facile articulations of curriculum decolonization. It aims to enunciate a double theoretical maneuver that moves away from reproducing theoretically old and obsolete binaries and towards championing a decolonizing task process that is ready to subvert and unsettle both the westernizing and de-westernizing process of knowledge production. And that's the questions behind decolonizing the curriculum, who's, who by. So the structure of the evening, I'll say a bit about the structure of the evening. It's been divided into 4 sections. The first section is the opening keynote speakers, and one of the keynote speakers has got 15 minutes to present. I do not think we have time for questions at the end of the section. After that, we'll move directly to the CAMRI plenary, and the 4 speakers will have 10 minutes each for the plenary, and we'll finish the presentations with the closing keynote speaker. And after that, we'll have 30 minutes for discussion. We really thought that it's best to have the discussions in the last 30 minutes, but of course, please put your questions, observations at the chat. Our colleague, Monica Ibrahim, is monitoring the chat, and she's going to be summarizing questions and will be bringing them back into the last 30 minutes of discussion. Also, for the keynote speakers, but also for the audience, we are recording the event. So for academic purposes, of course, and I think it's good to have it online for colleagues, for students to access it. It is a very important event, and the discussion, the debate is very important. It's good to be online, accessible to a larger audience. So the first section is our three opening keynote speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Layal Ftouni from Utrecht University. Layal, which I'm very glad to see again, is an assistant professor of gender studies and critical theory at the Graduate Center program at Utrecht University and a research affiliate at the Institute of Cultural Inquiry at the same university. She's the co-founder of the transnational network Arab Cultural Studies and the editor with Tariq Sabri of Arab Subcultures, Transformations in Theory and Practice. Layal has trained transdisciplinarily, working across feminist theory, cultural studies, post-colonial studies, and critical race studies. She has recently been awarded the Dutch Research Council Veni grant to undertake 3 years of research on the poetics and politics of life and death, human and environmental, in conditions of war and settler colonialism, and she'll be focusing on Syria and Palestine. Layal's talk is going to be Decolonizing in Solidarity. Our second keynote speaker is Professor Francis Nyamjo from the University of Cape Town, and he's going to be talking on decolonizing the curriculum, inspiration from the complete gentleman in Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinkard. Francis is professor of social anthropology at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He is recipient of the ASA UK 2018 Phage and Oliver Prize for the best monograph in his book, At Rhodes Must Fall, Nibbling at Resilient Colonialism in South Africa. Equally of relevance to the decolonizing the curriculum debate is Drinking from the Cosmic Gourd, how Amos Tutuola can change our minds. He is B1 rated professor and researcher by the South African National Research Foundation, a fellow of the Cameroon Academy of Science since August 2011, a fellow of the African Academy of Science since December 2014, and a fellow of the Academy of Science of South Africa since 2016. And our last speaker for the opening section is Professor Ashwin Punathambekar from the University of Virginia, and his talk is going to be on interrupting global media studies. Ashwin is the associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. He is the author of From Bombay to Bollywood, The Making of a Global Media Industry, co-author of Media Industry Studies, and co-editor of Global Bollywood, Television at Large in South Asia, and most recently, Global Digital Cultures, Perspectives from South Asia. So we can start with Layal. Layal, you've got the online floor.
You can hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Just a second. Thanks so much, Tariq and Winston, for the invitation to take part in this very urgent discussion today. I want to mention a few points that are crucial to the question and the project of decolonizing the university. I tried to be as concise as possible given the time limit. But before I start my talk, I want to mention here that I and all of us here on the panel, if I may speak for everyone, are in awe of the efforts and struggles of student movements to decolonize the university from South Africa to the UK, India, and other parts of the global North and South. As POC teachers and educators, we join you in arms. The broader project of decolonization today, a movement of dismantling structures of racism, imperialism, and colonialism as they persevere in our current socio-political and economic conjuncture, is a long-term project of liberation. A liberation that cannot simply be fought for without addressing the epistemological and institutional forms of coloniality that existed historically and persist in the very infrastructures of the university today. The emergence of student-led global movements is a testament, I believe, to the struggle to reclaim the university as a public space of radical critique and of nurturing forms of critical citizenship that can confront and dismantle coloniality, both within and outside the borders of the university. I want to zoom in my talk today on two key points. First, the project of decolonisation is a failed struggle if we do not fight against the neoliberalisation of the university. I will focus particularly on the UK, although the British and US universities seem to become the universal template that many universities in other parts of the globe are following. And second, I want to address the possibilities and challenges of decolonising the curriculum. I address those 2 points with a clear conviction that it's only through political and epistemic solidarity that a decolonial university can be claimed. And the current neoliberal environment that does so well to lump and split us, coalition building, is the only way forward. So the first point, decolonisation cannot be attained without contesting the neoliberalisation of university. I want to start first by evoking a key article that has put the question of university decolonisation under scrutiny. In their article, Decolonisation is Not a Metaphor, Tuck and Wayne Yang argue that the ubiquity of the language of decolonisation in universities and schools today, as important as that is in danger of becoming just another way to, and I quote, reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity, close quote. Writing more specifically from the context of settler colonialism in the Americas, decolonisation, both authors argue, cannot be made legible within the current structures of settler colonial educational institutions. They argue that decolonisation is first and foremost a project of liberation of land, a liberation that will inevitably reinstate indigenous forms of knowing and being. As important as their proposition is for settler colonial contexts, others, such as Bambra, outline the limitations of such a framework precisely because it does not account for the differentiated configurations of global capitalism and imperialism, and the ways in which they persevere in the university today. A turning away from the urgent project of dismantling the hold of colonial infrastructures in the university by calling first for the repatriation of land is an urgent call, of course, but it risks keeping the structure of the university in its present formation and functioning intact. Having said that, I found the assertion decolonisation is not a metaphor a very important contribution in the piece. Not because I agree fully with the authors that decolonisation of the university is an incommensurable project, but precisely because I believe that we should rescue decolonisation as a transformative radical praxis from the dangers of it becoming just another metaphor contained by the neoliberal university. Speaking of the context of the UK today, the ways in which frameworks of decolonising the university and equality, diversity and inclusion, or EDI, are being adopted and implemented raises questions about the political efficacy of decolonisation as it is taking place through top-down policies and initiatives. The recent absorptions of these initiatives within the neoliberal framework of the university is alarming, to say the least. And so our struggles to decolonize cannot be fought without working against the rising tide of the neoliberalization of education. The restructuring and management of the university on business models and market economics have had great effects on the questions of access, who gets to enter the university, as well as on critical knowledge production that recenters feminist, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist epistemologies in the humanities today. In other words, the deepening of neoliberalism has ensured the end of the university as we aspire it to be, a public service institution that can potentially reconfigure society on the tenets of radical egalitarianism and social justice. What we have is a university in crisis, an institution that either serves the transnational elite class of students or produces the indebted graduate, reproducing social inequalities along the lines of race, class, and gender. What we have is a university literally occupied by neoliberal management, a management that instrumentalizes the argument of decolonizing the curriculum and diversity to enact redundancies and close off programs. The recent debacle at Leicester University is a case in point, where English literature modules have been closed because, according to management, the course does not reflect the decolonial approach to knowledge, a claim that both lecturers and students in the program vehemently reject. We can see a similar process of the absorption of radical critique when we look at how universities issue support statements of Black Lives Matter and run Decolonizing and White Privilege workshop, or what Miriam Aurar so sharply calls it shortcuts to anti-racism, but yet manage to threaten with forced redundancies the last standing bastions of scholars and trade unionists who speak and teach the language of racial capitalism, anti-racist thoughts and struggles. I'm here referring particularly to the recent case at the University of East London of threatening trade unionist and anti-racist scholar Gargi Bhattacharya and 11 other staff members with redundancies as a result of UEL restructuring plans. This is the most recent of many similar redundancy rounds at the University of East London. These examples not only signal the adoption of decolonizing as a metaphor, to quote Tuck and Yang earlier, but they actually, these examples not only signal the adoptions of decolonization as a metaphor, as window dressing policies and frameworks to move with the times, but ones that clearly have material, socio-political and epistemological effects on the sustenance of the university as a space of critical thinking and pedagogy, whilst keeping the managerial class intact. As the late David Graeber said, neoliberalism invents bullshit jobs. In the context of the neoliberal university, this includes quality assurance, student experience to excellent framework management jobs. In other words, bullshit jobs that are said to rescue the university as an institution, when in fact, and in line with higher education government policies, they are making it impossible for the university to generate access to education and critical knowledge production, and especially for and by BAME students and scholars. The problem does not lie in the lack of funds, but in the ways in which it has been redistributed. And so a project of decolonization will have to work in solidarity with student organizing and struggles more broadly against class and racial inequalities that have widened in the aftermath of the economic crisis in Britain. So this is the first point. The second point I want to address here is that I want to look at the challenges and potential of the recent struggles to decolonize the curriculum. And I think it's precisely because of the conditions I outlined just now that the struggle to decolonize the curriculum is the more urgent, one that I believe should always be linked to other historical and also current struggles of decolonizing knowledge elsewhere. But what do we mean by decolonizing the curriculum? First, rather than diversifying or just adding texts, decolonizing the curriculum is a project of transformation, one that places the question of empire, racism, and colonialism as central to understanding the histories of the Euro-Americas and the formation of the world as we know it today. It is a project of learning that the racial exploitative and extractivist practices of slavery and colonialism persevere in the current socio-political and economic order we live in. It's a way of practicing a liberatory pedagogy that brings anti-colonial thought and struggles to the center of discussions of European political philosophy and history. Second, decolonizing the curriculum also means addressing current unprecedented world problems, from our current epoch of racial capitalocene to new forms of terror and settler colonial violence. And it's crucial here to note actually that the Education Secretary of the UK has instructed universities to adopt the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, or else universities will face financial cuts. And I'm here talking, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism explicitly forbids critiques of the state of Israel. And so it's a definition that conflates anti-Zionism or the critiques of a violent settler colonial occupation like Israel with anti-Semitism. And so in other words, a decolonizing struggle within the university is also a struggle against this sort of suppression of legitimate anti-colonial speech in teaching and research. Third, decolonizing the curriculum is also a project of connecting with different genealogies of feminists of color and anti-racist thought and struggles. of recognizing the legacy of struggles to push for certain debates within the university. And I'm thinking here particularly of the legacy of the discipline of cultural studies, which put the entanglement of race, class, and cultural hegemony on the agenda. And that is key to understanding how power operates within cultural institutions, including the university, to exclude working class and racialized communities. In addition, we can take cue from the work of transnational Black feminist scholars and activists whose epistemic interventions in the university cannot be underestimated. Examples of scholars and activists such as Jackie Alexander, Chandra Talbat Mohanty, Sheila Sandoval, amongst others, who believed that recentering knowledge of transnational feminist struggles against imperialism and patriarchy is a key strategy to decolonizing education and to exposing the omissions in disciplines of women's studies, particularly in US academies. These legacies, amongst others, should be recognized as having laid the foundations for the conversation we are having tonight. And finally, decolonization, of course, as Fanon would say, is a project of complete disorder. It's a continual process, one that seeks to undermine the Manichaean structures of the colonial world between colonizer and colonized. Speaking in the context of national independence movements on the African continent, Fanon warns that the colonized intellectual should neither strive for assimilation with the colonizer's culture, nor pursue an uncritical adoption of nativism and racialism that would appeal to some notions of essentialist identity. Rather, for him, the project of decolonization necessitates the breaks from structures of colonial domination by connecting to revolutionary struggles, and from which new political, social, and cultural order can emerge. I bring up this argument by Fanon because I recognize that in the quest to decolonize the university, I see a risk of reinscribing separatist identity politics on campus and activist circles, some of which play out in politics of refusal to engage with epistemologies solely on the racial and ethnic positions of authors. For example, there's an important difference between dismissing Marx on the basis of his whiteness or engaging with his arguments to account for racial capitalism, as Cedric Robinson did, or to attend to the particularities of capitalism in the colonial and post-colonial world, as scholars such as Fanon himself done in his proposition of this notion of stretching Marxism. In conclusion, of course, what I have laid out above is a long-term process. As teachers, students, precarious workers, working within the current economy of exhaustion, as Françoise Vergès calls it, we cannot pursue such a project without coming together in solidarity. What I mean by the we, it is a we that is not strictly bounded. It's not based on a unified identity, but one that is intersectional and that recognizes our differential implicatedness in systems of oppression along the axis of race, class, gender, and ethnicity. The we of solidarity is not bound to commonality of experiences and is rife with internal contradictions that can even sometimes undermine the coherence of the we. Nevertheless, it is a we that affirmatively persists in the struggle for social justice, and that recognizes that the future of the university can only be carved by recognizing that your liberation is entangled with mine. Only through coalition that we can topple this colonial neoliberal stronghold that is the university. In other words, the shit show we are in is not only the responsibility of the managerial class, it is us who need to take responsibility and action. Thank you.
Hello, I suppose it's my turn now.
Frances, yes, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation on decolonizing the curriculum. And I'm glad you referred to the starting point of the roads must fall as an anchor of that inspires what we are continuing with here as a conversation. I thought in many discussions about decolonization, there is a call for us to reach out and embrace sidestepped epistemologies, to look for into unlikely places for inspiration. And so in this regard, I decided to venture out of the academy to somebody whose credentials, even as he may have written novels that were embraced and in some regard celebrated, in others disparaged, but someone who would ordinarily not be within the academy because they would claim that he hasn't got the credentials to be a meaning maker and someone who imparts knowledge in a university, is the late Nigerian writer Amos Tutuola. And you would all be very familiar with his books, lots of books which were published by a renowned UK publisher, Faber and Faber. And the first book was The Palm Wine Drinker, published in 1952, followed by My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. I decided to draw from one of his novels, although his books actually demonstrate repeatedly in the universe that he depicts the sort of things I'm going to talk about. I thought I could focus just on one because it's very illustrative of what the challenges we are facing today about the academy and the need for decolonization. And that is The Palm Wine Drinker. And in it, there's a character that starts his life as a mere skull, a human skull, and through the act of borrowing body parts, becomes the most handsome person who is able to win the love of a young, beautiful lady with very tough conditions, challenging every suitor that comes her way. And he's able to borrow the body parts because he has got the means, and he's looking for the choicest body parts that would make him the most handsome person. He's also able to borrow material indicators of power, privilege, and in order to appear truly handsome and well endowed. And so as soon as this beautiful lady sets eyes on him, he doesn't have to say a word or to try to win her over. She pronounces, based on sensory perception, based on appearances, that you are the person I've been waiting for all my life. So that's the story of the skull. But what is important about the skull is not just the act of borrowing, but it's also the act of acknowledging his death and actually going out of his way to pay back his debt, even as it means deactivating himself back to a skull. Now, I will not dwell on that. You can read of the story yourself if you're not familiar with it. But I thought that this idea of self-activation to a level of potency to be efficacious in your pursuits is basically what we seek of curricula. Curricula are there to activate us as individuals, as universities, as communities, to a level of potency such that we can act and interact with one another in an efficacious manner. We can attain our ends. The challenge is that if we activate ourselves permanently by using borrowed gear, by using ideas and resources and possibilities that we have borrowed, and we decide to remain with what we have borrowed from others and not to acknowledge the debt that we have, our debt to others, then we live a situation that props us up permanently, and we begin to speak the language of completeness. So the example of Amos Tutuola is inviting us to disabuse ourselves of the pursuit of completeness and to consider curricula as always incomplete, whether they are defined for a bounded community which is inward-looking and does not have ambitions of self-expansion through reaching out and being mobile and conquering others. Just even within a very withdrawn community that is closed in on itself, curricula are normally incomplete. And incompleteness in this sense is not a negative. It is that they are open-ended and open to being enriched by new experiences because society is in itself dynamic. There are younger generations, the curricula might have been patriarchal in order, and new women's voices and gender conscious feminist voices come up and say, we have been excluded, we need inclusion. Working classes come up, and so on and so forth. So basically, a society that is on the move, a society that is mobile, necessarily requires curricula that is attentive to that dynamism, to that mobility, and so on. So even without coloniality or colonization, curricula normally are supposed to be very responsive. So I thought that I would start by giving a definition of a decolonized curriculum. And then from it, I illustrate exactly why I mean, I've come to that definition based on my borrowing from a very unlikely source, Amos Tutuola, someone who would normally be disparaged and not allowed within the corridors of the academy. So for me, a decolonized curriculum is one that recognizes and provides for incompleteness. And again, incompleteness not as a negative, but as a universal. Second, one that provides for mobility or motion. Because if we are incomplete, like the skull, and we are not mobile, we have no ambitions of self-enhancement of any kind. If we exclude mobility in our lives, then we may as well be sterile in our incompleteness. So there's an element of mobility, and when there's an element of mobility, there is an element of encounters. And encounters rub off on one another. A curriculum that is mobile because it is incomplete and seeks ways of self-enhancement, encounters other ways of seeing and doing. This rub off that particular influences it in one way or another, and then you find the curriculum being enriched in multiple ways, in a way that makes it non-linear, and it becomes what I might call a composite. A good curriculum, a curriculum that listens to the call for decolonization, that listens to the call for egalitarianism, and so on and so forth, is one that clearly is composite. It is also a curriculum that recognizes the debts that it has accrued through its mobilities of various kinds and encounters. And recognizing debt and indebtedness, even when you do not do what the skull did, pay back your debts and unravel yourself to a level of your original state of being. Even if you don't do that, there's a certain humility that comes with recognizing debt and indebtedness. Because for one thing, it disabuses you of the pretensions, of the tendencies to think of yourself as a self-made person, to think of yourself as supreme, to think of yourself as the example, the pinnacle of attainment, which others have to aspire to be like. think of yourself in complete terms, which is what colonialism did, which is what we are all fighting about. This idea that we are the model, we are complete, and every other person has to measure up to some degree to what I am and occupy a place according to the dictates of. It is also a curriculum, therefore, that is impoverished, because if you define yourself as complete, if you do not acknowledge the debt, your debt to others, thanks to your mobility and encounters, then there's no inspiration, there's no renewal, there is dictatorship and violence that comes from such a curriculum. And finally, I argue that a decolonized curriculum is definitely one that then provides for convivial scholarship. And convivial scholarship, the way I use it, is a scholarship informed by the centrality and the universality of incompleteness, which basically means that we find ourselves in the academy, in what we teach and what we learn, in a way that there is an openness and a receptiveness to new sources of inspiration, new contents from everywhere, whether epistemologically or in terms of practice or in terms of conversations. And what you have is never a situation of permanent answers, but always permanent new ways of questioning, new curiosities that come up, and so on. And this, if the inspiration is coming from somebody who would ordinarily not be in the academy, it tells us that a truly decolonized curriculum is one that systematically revisits history, excavates and foregrounds the silences that have been imputed on different societies by the colonizing ones, which with ambitions of supremacy, ambitions, illusions of completeness, and so on. So if we have a university where incompleteness is central, where everyone provides for mobility for everything and every idea and every epistemic system, and mobility is not confined to certain groups, whether by race, by gender, by geography, by class, etc., then you truly have very productive encounters, and you build a university on a compositeness of being. One that is constantly being enriched through the capacity to reach out to crevices and areas of society that have not yet been called upon to inspire the university. And you can rest assured that such a university would never drive itself to a crisis of credibility because of delusions of completeness. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Frances. Ashwin, it's your turn if you want to start.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the organizers of this terrific symposium, and timely one, and to Tariq Sabri and Winston Mano in particular for their kind invitation. And I'm glad this was the order in which we proceeded, because both Lael Fatuni's paper and Frances Nyamjo set up the broader contexts in relation to which I will be addressing this question of decolonizing the curriculum. So I should begin by confessing that I was initially hesitant to say yes to the kind invitation, because after all, I thought the last thing we need is yet another academic ensconced in an American university to approach the question of decolonizing the curriculum, especially given, as Lael noted, the term decolonization itself has clearly become overly broad, occasionally careless, and certainly deployed in many cases as a buzzword, within a broader but deeply problematic terrain of neoliberal diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in many universities across the US. But Tariq and Winston's nudges did help me recognize that there is one dimension of this broad problem that I might be able to tackle, and that is the question in the first instance of which curriculum are we talking about? So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to offer my highly situated take on one specific formation. It's called global media studies, that has since the late 90s, or mid to late 90s, has been a fertile terrain for media scholars in the US to study, write, and teach about media cultures, as they refer to it in the rest of the world. And I agree wholeheartedly with the observation that the symposium's organizers make, that global North academic approaches to this question of decolonization are incomplete, imperfect, and in need of overhaul. Perhaps one thing that scholars rooted in various educational institutions in the US and other parts of the Anglophone North Atlantic region can do then is reflect on the risks of categories like global media studies becoming almost too entrenched within Western academia. And in other words, asking the question which curriculum involves accounting for how we got here in the first place, what origin stories we might be able to narrate and contest, and then imagine what kinds of different paths we might take, the ways in which, for instance, Professor Nyamjo has laid out for us. So to begin with, for me, the question which curriculum and whose global media studies is part of the problem to do with the emergence of the digital as the keyword for our times. Over the past decade, as I became involved with research projects on digital cultures in South Asia, I recognized immediately the rather wobbly foundations on which we were standing. In attempts to provide a more robust historical and intermedial foundation for the digital, for example, to acknowledge and account for the fact that both the color television and the personal computer make their presence felt in Indian public culture in the mid-1980s, I recognize that we continue to operate with an exceedingly limited understanding of the turn to the global. So what I want to begin by suggesting is that the spatial bind within which we operate in this particular discipline, media studies writ large, and its US-UK origins in particular, has produced for us an incredibly stifling temporal frame within which we have so far studied the, as I put it, the rest of the world, and indeed how we have come to define the very idea of the global. So how did we get here? Here's my origin story. Global media studies emerges out of the moment of neoliberal globalization of the 1980s and early 1990s. By this time, it was clear that the various internationalisms of the post-war era were finished. The NWICO debates had ended. Bandung, Afro-Asian connections, and other forms of non-aligned solidarities were undermined, and new predominantly capitalist cultural and economic networks were already being forged. There's much to be said on this count, of course, but on the academic front, there are perhaps three forces that we can clearly identify now in hindsight, and some of these came up in Lyle's talk as well. The first one is the globalization of British cultural studies and the emergence of a diasporic generation of scholars of color who took the first steps away from modernization theory and development communication. Imagine, if you will, the patron saint of modernization theory, Daniel Lerner's face, slowly morphing into Arjuna Padurai's face. These scholars, second, were informed and inspired not only by cultural studies, critical political economy, and their fraught interactions with media studies in the US, but also, crucially, the post-colonial turn in history and literary studies. And the third one, which I find the most problematic, is cultural anthropology's discovery of media in the 1990s, and the turn to what they call public culture, which, to put it a little bit uncharitably, allowed so many of us to study people like ourselves. Urban, urbane, English-speaking middle-class subjects who could code switch with academics when it was needed. But on a more generous note, it was also about the fraught politics of going home to do fieldwork, as feminist scholars including Kiran Narayan and Purnima Mankekar, among others, have written about. On the whole, we might argue that global media studies is part of the high moment of an irresistible American empire, and with it, the ascendance of culture and multiple modernities as the master concepts. Coinciding with the rise of television studies in the British and American academies, the first generation of these scholars did produce an incredible range of work. PhD reading lists can never be the same, and we can't ignore that. But that said, Perhaps it is time to acknowledge the fact that with a few exceptions, this work has tended to rest on the study of a select few nations, select few media capitals and diasporic communities. India, Brazil, Lebanon, Hong Kong, South Africa, and a handful of other sites from which we have proceeded to make claims about the globe. And even within these national contexts, the range of spaces we have explored remain limited, and there is the very vexed issue of how we even have drawn lines around the question of the media. Now, some of these sites emerged as leading edges for good reason. There were colonial inheritances, particularly in the domain of language. But that said, the emphasis on urban middle-class culture has also meant that we have yet to grapple with the incredible deepening of media access, and with it, the material, linguistic, and political plurality that does mark contemporary media cultures across the world. Moreover, we remain interested in global media histories insofar as they neatly, in a linear fashion, bring us up to post-Fordist America. And let me be clear here, I also have in mind the difficulties of centering indigenous communities and cultures of media use within America, and not just histories outside the territorial boundaries of the United States. We would do well to pay more attention to work by scholars including Lisa Nakamura and Faye Ginsberg, for instance. However, other trajectories of media transition and their intersections with culture and politics have mattered largely as a matter of difference, a very nice, marketable kind of difference. Arvind Rajgopal is absolutely right to point out that any accounts of production, interpretation, or circulation appear simply too detailed or inaccessible to all but the area specialist, even when such accounts are working through social scientific or critical theories that make sense to those of us in the North Atlantic Academy. Now, the sidebar I should quickly add here is that the spatial bias was strengthened in great measure by transformations within American and British higher education, as we've heard so far. So, for example, decreasing support for language training, pressure to reduce time to graduation, a job market that's defined by marketable topics, and so on. In other words, there is a larger political economy of higher education that we would do well to keep on our radar, as our first two speakers have alluded already. So unpacking this, I would argue, would help us understand that this emergence of the global media studies was fortuitous for American departments of media and communication that were in the 90s for the first time beginning to contend with the question of difference and their staggering whiteness. I would wager good money that a survey of major departments across the US would reveal the tokenistic way in which the global was worked out, largely in relation to the discovery of national media cultures that were entering a predominantly American marketplace. We only have to look back 5 or 10 years to think about, for example, the investment that so many of us had in BRICS media cultures, right? So put simply, global media studies has so far served as a formation that allows British and American universities to bracket the question of difference and produce what Stuart Hall has called segregated visibility. In a fight for already scarce resources, framing the global as somewhere else and in some other time, in relation to the palatable politics of market multiculturalism, ends up severing connections with students and scholars in other locations. In a 1992 interview, Stuart Hall noted wryly the irony of largely white media and cultural studies gatherings talking about post-colonialism in America without bothering to engage the Department of Afro and Afro-American Studies right next door. So if this is one side of the problem, the other is quite simply that race within media and communication studies has become anchored to questions of national history and the domestic concerns of US institutions and state policy, rather than as a phenomenon that has relevance globally. So John Jackson, a media anthropologist, has spoken about this unspoken amnesia about race and globalization when he writes that, quote, certain provincializing assumptions within American anthropology today might imagine globalism to be far better spied in other parts of the world. The result being a reproduction of American exceptionalism, be it after 9/11 or after even Obama's election or Trump, even in the arenas of race and inequality, in particular, America's wanted colorblind nationalism. So if this is one way to diagnose this problem of studying the global within this particular one discipline, where do we go from here, right? Perhaps we are at a turning point, a moment when there are actually opportunities to slow down and develop a multi-perspectival view. to look sideways and askance at our own practices, to question, as Professor Nyamja reminded us, to question what seems to have become canonical, and then return, hopefully, with that kind of mobility to a more capacious and diverse set of possibilities. Which brings me to my second key argument. Instead of trying to break out of this freeze frame by taking a straightforward back to the future style historical approach, perhaps we can take inspiration from queer theory here, from Elizabeth Freeman's work on what she calls temporal drag. Freeman, writing about the figure of the lesbian feminist, asks, how can we know for certain that something is securely done with? She's thinking here about the relevance to contemporary queer politics, observing that often marginalized figures are seen as a big drag, a figure inexorably harkening back to gender politics that were essentialized, normative, and exclusive. And she pushes us to think about the way in which we can all feel this pull backwards. So her emphasis on the necessity for cultural theorists to consider forms of agency that are not only about moving upward and onward, but might be a productive pull backwards. This is not to suggest that we do not need good, deep histories of media cultures from different moments and contexts. We do have to start somewhere, but perhaps we can also think about the ways in which maybe an eminently sensible way is to think about what are the spaces and what kinds of evolutions have happened from which we can begin to think about our contemporary media formations. In other words, what logics of transformation and historical shifts might we uncover, and how might this then encourage us to think with the modalities of change within global media terrains that might begin to reshape our curriculum and our syllabi? Put simply, rethinking how we constitute something called the global in our field is perhaps a small, modest, but crucial interruption to make, even before we pose the question of how to decolonize the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aswin. Thank you to all the speakers. You kept up brilliantly within the 15 minutes, so much so that we've got a few minutes remaining in the session. Maybe for a couple of questions. Would that be okay, Tariq and Winston? Should we have a couple of questions? Yeah?
Yeah.
So anyone, would anyone want to ask a question? Urgent, very urgent question? Or do you prefer to move on and have all the questions in the end? You can unmute yourselves, ask.
Maybe I have one question if I can.
Yes, of course.
Hi.
You tell me your name first and affiliation, thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'm Charlotte Kok from Ghent University, where I co-chair the diversity board of our Faculty of Law and Criminology, but I have a cultural studies background myself. So I had a question for Layal, if I may. So you ended your talk with a very inspiring words to think about the fact that the we of solidarity, I'm looking at my notes, is not one identity, but that your liberation is entangled with mine. And I find it very nice. Now, some weeks ago, we had kind of a debate in our diversity board where we received the Decolonize Ghent University message from the students. And the question was, well, how can we as institutionalized boards work together with the students to not achieve this, but to think about it, to act upon it, to start decolonize? Well, but we noticed it is quite hard actually to come at the same level of making this we. Of course, on the one hand, you have an institutional background and you are employed by the university. But on the other hand, we as a group kind of agreed with the big points, but it was hard to get on one line with the students on this. So I have a simple, though quite complex question. How do we do that? Do you have experience with that?
Yes, that's a good question. I was thinking particularly of the we as the we that brings together teachers, students, and precarious workers, to actually think about the project of decolonizing the university as one which inevitably has to be one premised on solidarity. And I was particularly thinking of the ways in which kind of, I mean, I'm inspired specifically by Black feminist movements, and particularly, for example, the Combahee River Collective, who were very keen on specifically questioning the ways in which, I mean, I'm particularly here talking more broadly in movement terms, not within the university as such, but they were specifically keen on addressing the erasure of Black women from women's movement and from Black national struggles during the civil rights movement, but they inevitably refused to think about sort of liberation as a project of that necessitates forms of fractionalization. So for them, fractionalization or sort of you know, one group, they say, cannot topple down the system, right? So it is always a project of working with or working together. And I remember they also talked about the fact that, you know, as women, you know, as Black feminists and as women, they talked about the fact that sort of sexual politics under patriarchy affects them just as class and race affects them. And so they were sort of particularly thinking about, despite their erasure from women's movements, particularly white women's movements, and their erasure from sort of Black nationalist sort of struggles, that they could still see ways in which forms of coalition could emerge, and forms of coalitions in which one's liberation is always sort of entangled with another. And I thought that this is a really crucial way of thinking intersectional solidarity, or a crucial sort of framework of thinking intersectional solidarity within the university, to take cue from such movements and from such sort of inspiring feminist political movements. Yes, so I mean, so my point was particularly looking at students, teachers, and precarious workers within the university. So that was my, so to think about really starting with a student-led, teacher-led movement that is based on solidarity, and that can inevitably sort of work on reclaiming the university not as a space that is specifically sort of determined by market economics as we see the university today. So it's a way of rethinking the university as a place of as a public institution and as a space for the emergence of radical critique, of nurturing critical citizenship. And so these are some of the thoughts that that really brought me to thinking solidarity in that way. But I think in the context of the Netherlands, I mean, I'm aware of some initiatives to decolonize that always sort of, you know, you have sort of diversity commissions within university. And there has been student-led movements, and I'm sure you know of that, particularly the University of Color movement, the occupation in 2015 at the University of Amsterdam, which actually did lead to the university asking two key scholars within the Netherlands, I'm sure you know of Black feminist Gloria Wekker and Rolando Vasquez, who ended up actually drafting a diversity report. But unfortunately, because the diversity report did not have procedural demands, and they did not have an agreement with the university to commit to implementing these reports. I mean, I also believe in some form of strategic essentialism. For diversity to actually, for change to happen in the university, that has to go first through certain sort of policies. But I think in the UK, I think it has sort of particularly, it's gotten to a certain degree within which policies are also used to enact redundancies and to sort of create unnecessary managerial jobs. And I see that actually the Netherlands is heading that way somehow. Sorry, I think I answered the question in very long terms.
Before we move to the plenary, we had from the chat a request whether it is possible to post the simultaneous live transcript. And And I think that when we upload the video, we can do it in such a way that we release the captions. We have the captions also. I don't know if that would be of help, but obviously we can do it once the video is released. And also another question, and we can answer that because it's going to be much longer in the final discussion, is whether the University of Westminster is also adopting IHRA. So bear that in mind, and then we can discuss it in the final debate. So thank you so much for the 3 keynote speakers, for the wonderful presentations that started already discussion, started us thinking. And now we move to the plenary session, which is organized by CAMRI. So the first speaker is Andrea. Then we move on to Tariq, Winston, and Sin.
Hello, Rosa. Thank you so much.
Hi, Andrea.
Should I get started? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see the slides and we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so I am Andrea Medrado. I am a lecturer at the School of Media and Communication at the University of Westminster, and I joined the university in September last year. So I'll start my talk saying how 6 months ago, I moved back from Brazil, where I'm from, to the UK, because I wanted to get out of a country where there is a big climate of villainization of research, thinkers, philosophers, people like Paulo Freire, who are now being villainized in the country. So I'm calling this a new arrival talk. And arrivals and departures, as we all know, can be painful. So I decided to focus on what I brought in the luggage with me from Latin America. Could some of these perspectives that came from Brazil and Latin America perhaps provide paths for decolonization in times when we talk so much about it? And I'll tell you right away that I'm very skeptical about this idea of a kind of a decolonizing machine where things go through and come out with a 100% decolonized tag. Echoing Leonardo Custodio, decolonization is more of a horizon. But before I look at the horizon, I look back at my own history. I come from a country whose historical formation is said to be the product of the mixture of Portuguese, Africans, and indigenous. And I would hear that my great-grandfather was Portuguese, my other great-grandfather was English, the other great-grandfather was Syrian, and that there always are Africans and indigenous somewhere in the family. Somewhere where exactly? Which generation? Were some of my ancestors Pataxó, Bantu, Yoruba, Tupinambá? I don't know. Just like the title of today's seminar, lots of questions. So, decolonization is a process that requires us to look at everyday stories as well. So here's one. When we arrived in our new home in London in August last year, we had to be isolated as it happens now. And my son, who was 6 at the time, was immediately in love with the bathtub, not Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, the bathtub, because in Brazil, we don't usually have bathtubs at home. Well, if you try, a bathtub can be a swimming pool, an exercise of imagination. We made paper boats, and I look at these paper boats floating, dissolving in the water, and it kind of represented how I felt in my new arrival to the old world. In the past, a project on paper. In the future, navigation possibilities. In the present, vulnerability. How can we gain strength? I looked at Oliver, my son, and the water transforming into a mess in the bathtub, our hands transforming paper into boats, the palm of our hands and the number 5. 5 ways in which coming from Latin America can be inspiring for a decolonizing horizon. And I will use Portuguese and Spanish words to communicate these inspirations, these 5 inspirations, although I'm aware that they are also colonial languages, of course. First one is El Arrebato. Gloria Anzaldúa has written about the stages required for achieving a higher consciousness. And she calls the first stage of this journey el arrebato, or the rapture. She describes this as the movement that casts you from your personal Eden, showing that there's something lacking in your queendom. El arrebato turns your world upside down, cracks the walls of reality. So el arrebato brings a wounding, a shock, a collision that triggers major changes. It's an ending, but also a beginning. For me, el arrebato came in 2008 when I learned that Mateus Rodrigues, who was 8 at the time, a little bit older than my son is now, was killed by the police in a favela in Brazil when he was going to buy bread. And perhaps the killing of George Floyd last year represented el arrebato for a lot of us. His words, "I can't breathe," echoing what Black people and people of color have been saying for centuries. For us here, I'd like to ask, at an institutional level, how much are we willing to allow for these cracks and these ruptures to bring about the changes and the new beginnings? From rupture, I move to healing and care. Oh, a woman talking about care, how cliche. But I'm not talking about care in a stereotypical way of that woman who sacrifices herself to care for the children, to care for others. I'm inspired here by a talk by the scholar, Colombian scholar Clemencia Rodriguez, called My Favorite Feminists. She talked about original peoples and how they see no separation between caring for oneself, caring for others, caring for the environment. In the same way that we care for our kids, we can care, I don't know, for our liver or cholesterol levels. We should care for the water. So here's my second question. Just like decolonization, we've been talking a lot about well-being. Are we conscious enough that individual well-being cannot be separated from collective well-being, from environmental well-being? I looked up the word visceral in English, and it said characterized by intuition rather than by intellect. And that says a lot in terms of colonial view of the world. Can't we have intuition become part of intellect? This is a difficult exercise which requires us to tune senses. Western rationality has taught us to clarify, reveal, focus. Perhaps we should not create hierarchies of senses, valuing vision, for example, over hearing. Doing field work in my hometown, Salvador, Bahia, I needed to listen to what the soundscapes were telling me, sounds coming out of speakers, radios, street radios, graffitis were speaking through, street markets, foods, smells, flavors, all forms of media. In Portuguese, sentido means sense, but it also means to feel in the past participle. It also means meaning, and sentida also means touched in the feminine. I never noticed what a great word this was. And my fourth inspiration was a present from Jair Veiga, a Colombian scholar as well, when he talked about the legacy of Orlando Falsborda. Falsborda was a disenchanted scholar. He was disenchanted with the church, with institutions, and many generations in Latin America have been enchanted by ideas of opportunity. I grew up believing that Brazil was the country of the future. Well, should we now allow ourselves to be disenchanted? From an environmental point of view, or point of listening, or point of feeling, it's now becoming harder and harder to assume that the future will be better. But I'm not pessimistic necessarily about this. Maybe it's an opportunity for a less exploitative future, one that doesn't focus on economic profit as what gets better and brings back the urgency of more connection with nature in the present, as indigenous communities have been telling us. Universities are all about selling futures. Should we talk less about better futures and talk more about urgent presents? And my last inspiration comes also from a Latin American seminar called Comunicación desde el Territorio, Communication from the Territory, organized by Omar Rincón. They adopted a simple dynamic that caught my sentidos. For each person that gave a lecture, they would include a long introduction that recorded by a friend, someone close to that person. For example, A dear colleague and friend from Mexico, Claudia Magallanes Blanco, was introduced not just in terms of her research, but also as Sophia's mother, someone from Veracruz. And I think that this is something that an academia rooted in coloniality sometimes fails to do. People's works entail who they are, where they arrived from, where they are located. These cannot be separated. Colonization is all about dehumanizing, erasing histories. So my final question is, when trying to decolonize, should we not be promoting more of these introductions? In the hectic timing of our lives and calendars filled with Microsoft Teams calls, can we take our time for proper introduction, apresentação, not rush them? Returning to the beginning of the presentation, how can we navigate our colonial pasts? How can we decolonize our minds, our curricula, when so much of who we are and what we know is shaped by coloniality? What are we doing to avoid navigating turbulent times in a paper boat? Just like the title of today's seminar, lots of questions. Before I became a British citizen, technically, I would have to go through customs in Heathrow in a space called other parts of the world. I swear it's what the sign said in Heathrow Airport. So how can we include other authors, other views from other parts of the world without otherizing? That's what I had to say. I'm sorry, there was a brief interruption from my son wrapped in his towel.
Thank you, Andrea. So next, I think is Tariq. Tariq, you can have the online floor.
Thank you so much, Rosa. So Tariq Sabri, I'm a member of the Communication and Media Research Institute. In his novel, Tattooed Memory, the Moroccan sociologist Abdelkabir Khatibi writes, "L'autre soir, j'ai rêvé que mon corps était des mots." باللغة العربية, in Arabic, راودني حلما الليلة الماضية كان فيه جسدي عبارة عن كلمات. And in English, the other evening, I dreamt that my body was words. In the novel, Khatibi demonstrates how writing in French involves two acts, an act of sacrifice and an act of rebirth. Writing in this context amounts to an inner exile, a symbolic death, but a death that promises a metamorphosis. Death through language holds the potential for reconfiguring the broken connection between the body, desire, and language, asserting, as MacNeice put it, quote, "the possibility so diminished in the languages of empire of concrete polyvalent expression," unquote. How do we liberate the sign is what preoccupies the work of Abdelkabir Khatibi. Khatibi calls for a pensée autre, a thought of difference, a way of doing decolonizing that re-articulates difference without recourse to essentialist absolutes or teleological purity, integrity, authenticity. The Occident, observes Khatibi in his novel Tattooed Memory, quote, "is part of me, a part that I can only deny insofar as I resist all the Occidents and all the Orients that oppress and disillusion me." It is this decolonizing archaeology that inspires the Arab Cultural Studies Network and its project of decolonizing Arab media and cultural studies. I argued elsewhere that to articulate the new kinds of hermeneutics and the new language upon which media and Arab cultural studies can rely to interpret social and cultural phenomena, it is essential to work through and follow a double critique mechanism, ensuring that both the endogenous, exogenous, cultural phenomena, forms of knowledge, their interpretation, and the types of conjectural eminence they produce are always subjected to a distantiated double refutation. However, this dual critical process is by itself, I argue, not sufficient to help us meet our decolonizing task, the creation of a conscious, critical cultural project that is aware not only of its own temporality, time consciousness, a sense of historical time and theoretical situatedness, but also its relational positionality to the other, to other temporalities, its being otherwise, and of being in and out of its own time and temporality. This necessitates the invention, I argue, and incorporation of a whole new ethics or of otherness, a whole thought around difference, not just in its ontological sense, but also as a necessary prerequisite for an ethical mode of knowledge production. For it to function, this kind of ethics or thought of difference, as Khatibi puts it, it must be articulated through a two-way epistemic trajectory, that of decolonization and de-decolonization. So here the idea is to oscillate up in a plane of thoughts, ideas and concepts, paradigms, back and forth from immanence to transcendence. And here I mean the transcendence of any form of immanence. So the objective here is the initiation of an ethics and ontology of otherness, a transcendental kind of empiricism where thought and being are determined not merely through the ontologizing of experience and the championing of creativity, but also through an unconditional form of engagement with the other's thought, the other's technique, thus avoiding the traps of reverse Orientalisms that we're all already very aware of. Since the structures and processes of social communication are, as we learn from Nicholas Garnham, deeply embedded within the wider structures and processes of a given social formation, and because the moral, rational subject is always socially formed, it is imperative when decolonizing the curriculum not only to engage with social theory, but it is also necessary in order to understand the wider processes and structures that determine media, culture, and society to, quote, to make a diversion by way of philosophy, in order to understand how and why the debates have been set up in the way they have been set up. Also, since the discipline of media and cultural studies has developed as a reaction to modernity's pathologies, right? We need, by way of decolonizing the curriculum, to engage our global student cohorts, not only with international media systems, important though it is as a task, but also with sociological and philosophical debates on modernity emerging from Africa, India, China, the Middle East, or what is perhaps now readily called the Global South. I see the decolonizing of the curriculum as a process of re-territorialization, a creative act of connectivity and contextualization. Decolonizing the curriculum, or the act of undoing decolonizing, is part of the double critique proposed here, but it must not be misunderstood for inaction or a mere intellectual arbitrariness, bourgeois indifference, if you like, but as an intentional creative mechanism. The flight here is not from responsibility or engagement, historicity, but from decaying and redundant ideas, from metaphysics and the myth that come with essentialized narratives of becoming. Thus, what is required, I think, is not merely a process of decolonizing, but a perpetual movement between decolonizing and de-decolonizing. To decolonize the curriculum is also to do cultural translation from a position of double absence. And I'm here using Abdelmalek Sayyad's concept, that of double absence. As diasporic scholars, our work as cultural translators is doubly alienating. First, as Rami Ali put it in relation to Arab cultural studies, quote, because of our implication in the political economy of Western scholarship on the Arab world, and the continuing inaccessibility of an inability to translate our literature for the silent Arab apparition that is both our subject and object, unquote. Second, as area studies scholars working at the margins of an ex-nominated field of media and cultural studies, we find ourselves visible, but only in relation to our marginality, to the silent but unspoken norm, British media and cultural studies, European media and cultural studies, and so on and so forth. So to do decolonizing in this context is to be doubly absent and doubly invisible. In her groundbreaking work on being included, Sarah Ahmed invites us, quote, to think specifically about institutional life, not only how institutions acquire a life of their own, but also how we experience institutions phenomenologically, if you like, or what it is to experience something as institutional. So decolonizing the curriculum calls for a serious and systematic engagement with the role of the institution and our positionalities as cultural translators within it. The institutions, to conclude, have historically proven to be resilient to change. And we therefore have to ask, what is the institution's role in decolonizing the curriculum? Is it a calculated gesture, an artifact, a part of a techno-instrumental rationality, where the intention lies more in stabilizing or formatting semantics around decolonizing? Or is the institution genuinely interested in a radical rethinking of knowledge production in what appears to me to be a globalized world, a changed world? I think it would help the Decolonizing Curriculum project if these questions were asked not just to provoke, because these questions have been asked before, but in order for them to become serious objects of empirical inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you very much. So it's Winston's turn. Winston, are you ready to start?
I am ready to start.
Okay, good.
And thank you everyone for coming to the seminar. Yeah. I'm talking about de-westernizing or decolonizing journalism and African media studies in Africa, looking at how the curricular challenges can be overcome. In so doing, I will draw from some of our recent work. I've just published an edited volume with my colleague, Viola Milton. She's at the University of South Africa. But also within the volume, there are excellent contributions which directly address some of the issues we are talking about. I know I have 10 minutes, so what I would like to say is that these issues, when they are translated to Africa, we are talking about marginalization and misrecognition of African epistemologies. And this has been a very big problem that parallels the routine social, cultural, political, economic disempowerment and exclusion of the continent's people from global processes. So it's not just in the classroom, it's also outside. And when you look at the area of media and communication, one can see that this is an old problem. There have been attempts since, for example, 1977, after the independence of countries in the global south, to redress the asymmetrical imbalances that affect curricula, that affect education in the global south. And this is manifest, for example, in UNESCO's documents in 1977, UNESCO International Commission for the Study of Communication Problems. Then the Many Voices, One World of 1980. Then it was followed up by another report in 1982. But what became very clear in UNESCO's efforts is something that we are talking about today, the issue of trying to relate education to transformation. But unfortunately, that momentum in the 80s seemed to have not had much effect, because we are still talking about the same kind of problems. So what we are talking about, the problem, is the poverty and narrowness of academic approaches in Africa, but I am going to talk about journalism and African media studies as an area that has direct challenges as a result of some of the problems. The end of colonialism did not necessarily result in the end of coloniality. And this compounds the element of narrowness and poverty of education in Africa. There have been attempts in our field. For example, we had conferences and events to de-westernize, to internationalize, to globalize. But these attempts, one can argue, my colleague Diatus was very passionate, and we had a big conference with many people in 2008, where we talked about internationalizing, because at Westminster there was a belief that we can do something about this, we can bring together people. But what I'm talking about here is that this has not solved some of the problems that we have in the world. In the African context, for example, there is continued over-reliance on Western, global Northern theories and methodologies. There is endless questioning about the value of education. Somebody was saying the education there that we have is encouraging remembering rather than thinking. So it doesn't produce thinking people. And in some cases, it encourages repetitions, and people actually repeat. Sometimes they do a degree after a first degree, or a master's, they have 2, 3 masters. And this is a symptom of the problems that we have in the African context, that people are not sometimes very clear about the purpose of this education. So what is the necessary curative to this? Apart from these events that are really laudable, there have been also other attempts. But let me, from the onset, also point out that not everything in the global north is bad, or not everything in the global south is good. This is a point made by Rodney Gumede and Colin Chassie in their chapter, which is in the book that I have pointed out, Routledge Handbook of African Media and Communication. Their chapter dwells on the issue of curriculum change from a global south point of view. So we need to think about the idea of not throwing the baby with the bathwater. But what we also need to think about is to have difficult conversations about some of the things that have produced the impasse. So from the point of view from where I stand, the necessary corrective, we argue, is a transdisciplinary approach that is underpinned by knowledge that is from the global south, and from Africa. We are talking about knowledge that gives the African vantage point, that addresses African lived experiences. So with my colleague, we have coined, adopted the notion of Afroecology as a necessary corrective, one that brings together some of the things that we are talking about in terms of education that is transformative. So our use of Afroecological kind of understanding to curriculum change draws on critical theory, post-colonial theory, decoloniality, indigenous knowledge, social justice, human rights, as frameworks that can assist in decolonizing education. We are also very much aware that, the African condition is not just marginalization, it's also misrecognition. Education from Africa, or even when you have courses on African media studies, it's very, it's a very slippery path. Sometimes you can have African course without Africa in the focus. So there are many, many challenges. So it's marginalization, it's misrecognition, and it has resulted in neglect of African condition. So what we are proposing is a transdisciplinary approach to education, using this Afroecological approach as a heuristic lens. And I will outline what that can do. I'm very glad to Professor Nyamjo, because we use his approach of incompleteness to underpin our approach to Afroecology. So in terms of the Afroecological approach, it really engages in a multidimensional and multidirectional aspect, the knowledge processes and responses from an African perspective. For us, it is a very useful mode of intellectual inquiry, which can be like cultural studies, post-colonial studies. We have drawn from history, we have drawn from anthropology. Professor Nyamjo is from anthropology, and we have repurposed this Afroecological framework and incorporated this as a decolonial heuristic tool that tactically mobilizes African heritage and can be very useful as a theoretical heuristic tool that can help to bring some of the issues that are marginalized within the African context. So the main person who coined Afroecology is the late Professor Dan Nabdere, but we have moved on from his appropriation and infused Afroecology with other concepts. For example, for us, pluriversality is very important, whereby we use Conway and Singh's approach, whereby it's important to have multiple ontologies, to have multiple worlds represented within the curricula. And I don't have much time, so what I would do is to go straight into the tool that we are mobilizing and how it will work. We use examples. How much time do I have, Rosa?
You don't have any time, Winston. Sorry, it's 31.
Okay.
So can you?
I will just conclude.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say we use the examples from, for example, from Nairobi, whereby there was a theater department which was multidisciplinary. We use also the example from the University of Zimbabwe, which was multidisciplinary. But we go beyond this and propose a transdisciplinary approach for curriculum development. We also draw from other people, like, for example, Ngugi's global athletics is very important in thinking about how you can have multiple epistemologies at play, and it should be problem-led rather than looking at disciplines. Disciplines can be very conservative. So what we are proposing is a transdisciplinary approach, which can be convivial, which recognizes that knowledge within disciplines is incomplete. It needs to add other things. And when you have a transdisciplinary approach, it can be much more useful and productive. Thank you, Rosa. In terms of the matter at stake, the idea of decolonizing, de-westernizing the curricula, from an African perspective, what we have done is to excavate a theory and to repurpose it, to build it into a transdisciplinary approach. And this theory is one by a Ugandan scholar called Danny Nabdere. He proposed a theory called Afroecology, in which he thought that what is at stake is the idea that the African condition must be investigated as a historical phenomenon in which African achievements are properly recognized.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Thank you, Winston. Thank you so much. The last speaker from the CAMRI plenary is Sin. Sin, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Rosa. Also, thanks to Tarek and Winston for organizing such a stimulating and timely event. A couple of years ago, I watched the verbatim documentary play SOS. The title of the show was a decolonization, not just a buzzword. I was wondering actually at that time if a similar discussion would ever take place at our university. Here we are now. So this is a very positive sign. And also I'm very happy to be part of this event. As I mentioned by other presenters, there are challenges to the promotion of a decolonizing or de-westernizing approach. So far, only a small group of liberal-minded scholars, both Western and non-Western, and in a limited number of academic fields, such as international communication and some subfields of media studies, have begun to engage with the de-westernizing, internationalizing, or decolonizing research agenda. So there's a long way to go to make the field more de-westernized. I think the westernizing approach is a self-reflexive in nature, but at the same time, it represents an intellectual dilemma, which has been summarized well by Deepak Chakravarty in his book, Provincializing Europe. According to Chakravarty, European or Western thought in general is both indispensable and inadequate in helping us to think through the various life practices that took place in India and any other Western and non-Western societies. So he set a goal to explore this simultaneous indispensability and inadequacy of Western thought in his Provincializing Europe project. So I think similar objectives could be set for the de-westernizing media studies. In relation to Chinese media studies specifically, I would like to cite one of the leading scholars in the field, Yue Zhizhao. Reflecting on her own intellectual journey, in a book chapter published in 2015, Yue Zhizhao used a very good analogy. She sees the process of studying the Chinese media as to shoot at the target that appears easy to focus on at first sight, but it's in actuality rather elusive. On the surface, she says, the target appears static, as there has not been any radical transformation in the basic structure of the Chinese media system after more than 30 years of reform. Upon closer examination, however, the target has both undergone dramatic mutations in its shape and shed much of its original color. Moreover, as she adds, in the context of a rapidly evolving global order, the target has repeatedly defied conventional expectations in terms of the direction of its movement, realigning its geopolitical relations. So the basic questions Zhao asks include, which direction to look at? What does the target look like at a particular moment? What lenses to use and how to aim? What kind of shooting guns do we have in hand? And are they adequate for the purpose? I think these challenges and issues remain very relevant today. And the issues are also directly relevant to today's discussion. For example, what kind of shooting guns do we have in hand? Are they adequate enough for the purpose? Can the de-westernizing approach serve as our new shooting gun? And if so, is it also suitable for studying the case of China? Is it suitable for me as a Chinese media scholar who is also studying China's soft power, especially its recent aspiration to cultural rejuvenation? According to the prevailing Western interpretation, the founder of Chinese traditional culture is Confucius, Kongfuzi, who lived in the spring and autumn period between 770 and 476 BC. This was a period full of political upheavals. However, Confucius in his serious teaching notes, made very clear that he created nothing. He was just trying to restore the principle of harmony through teaching, learning, practicing those principles on a daily basis. Confucius sincerely believed that harmony once existed in the golden age of Chinese society, but had been lost later on due to the endless political and social upheavals he witnessed during his lifetime. As we can see from the essence of Confucianism, the ultimate goal has been restoring the harmony within a society through reinforcing and practicing certain moral principles at home and outside, rather than seeking a new political or cultural creation. In this sense, China's current cultural rejuvenation claim is not just a political rhetoric, but should be seen as the continuation of an unfinished historical project embedded in Chinese history and culture. This is not to deny that the top-down nature of the project, the implementation efforts of the Chinese state in recent years have also a lot to do with the exercise of power. There has been a lot of debate about China's soft power as defined by Joseph Nye. But essentially, the claim needs to be understood in the Chinese historical and cultural context. Such a historical context is also needed for understanding China's rising nationalism in a non-Western society where the collective public memory is still associated with Western and Japanese imperialism and the century-long humiliation starting from the First Opium War with the British Empire in 1839. For me, employing a de-westernizing approach to study the international expansion of Chinese media and communication doesn't necessarily mean, as some scholars have argued, objecting or distancing myself from the Western notion of soft power. This would be almost impossible anyway. In my study of China's soft power, I'm also interested in the questions: soft power to whom? Power exercised by whom? And power to what ends? After raising this question, I have found myself being caught in a perpetual circle. On the one hand, I depend on Western notions of power, modernity, and media credibility to justify the importance of my research. On the other, these concepts are inadequate for understanding the motives underlying China's cultural rejuvenation aspirations. Certainly, I'm not alone facing such a dilemma. As I mentioned earlier, Chakravarti faced similar challenges when studying the experience of India. Also, I do agree with many scholars who are also interested in the topic that the notion of soft power itself needs to be critically examined in the Western, especially American historical context, in which Joseph Nye coined the notion. Incidentally, while Nye claimed that he created the notion of soft power, he also once admitted he was inspired by Lao Tzu's kingly Dao, 老子的王道. Lao Tzu is a famous Chinese philosopher who lived in the 6th century BC, the same period as Confucius. So perhaps Lao Tzu's philosophy may provide a better theoretical grounding for my research on China's soft power. If I use Lao Tzu's philosophy, does that mean that my study of China's soft power will become more de-westernized? I definitely need to reflect more on these issues, which I intend to do in my forthcoming book on China's soft power. But overall, I agree. De-westernizing is an important project, and it's self-reflexive in nature, though it won't be easy to accomplish. In my view, its main goal is not to dismiss a given set of Western thoughts or approaches. Instead, it should be to promote intellectual self-reflexivity and equality. I'd like to conclude my contribution by sharing with you my favorite quote from Confucius. By 3 methods, we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is the noblest. Second, by imitation, which is the easiest. Third, by experience, which is the biggest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sin, and thank you all colleagues from CAMRI for the plenary. We don't have much time for questions, so we have to move on directly to our closing keynote speaker, Professor Sabelo Gatsenin-Glovu from the University of Weymouth in Germany, who is going to be presenting on decolonizing the curriculum. What do we do with dominant existing knowledge? Dr. Glovu Gatseni is professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South with emphasis on Africa at the University of Beirut in Germany. He previously worked as a research professor and director of scholarship in the Department of Leadership and Transformation in the Principal and Vice Chancellor's Office at the University of South Africa. He was also the 2019 visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. He's a leading decolonial theorist with over 100 publications in the fields of African history, African politics, African development, and decolonial theory. His latest major publication is Decolonization, Development and Knowledge in Africa, Turning Over a New Leaf. Professor Gatsenin-Glovu, your floor is yours. Thanks. It's 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I feel like doing just a summary and a closing, but let me try to address 2 other questions. And thank you for the colleagues who have spoken before me, because they've already addressed some of the epi-colonial problems which are haunting the higher education sector. And it fundamentally therefore means that I need to try and address the last 2 questions. And those are the questions of who is supposed to do the decolonization of curriculum and how is that going to be done. They look like very straightforward and easy questions, but I think they are very complex, as I will try to demonstrate. And I will try to draw really from a practical experience rather than from theoretical works, as my colleagues have done, because that is done already. And I want to draw from my own personal experience as somebody who have worked first as an academic, and secondly, I worked as an administrator within a university during a time when this issue of decolonizing the university is very, very, very topical. Let me put it in very simple terms, perhaps at the risk of simplifying issues. I think when the students' movements broke out in South Africa in 2015, 2016, they pointed more to the administration. Why is it that they are not taking responsibility in decolonizing the universities and indeed taking leadership in that area? And what the administration under pressure then had to do in many of the universities, they had to take action. And what type of action did they take in order not to be accused of being either against or the transformation or the decolonization? Most of them, particularly in the university where I worked, they then established new units which were supposed to actually spearhead the transformation, not only of the curriculum, but transformation or decolonization in the broadest sense. And because of the establishment of those units, as a result of the pressure from the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movements, there were some colleagues within the universities who then had a mistaken view that it was up to those units which were established. Particularly where I worked at the University of South Africa, it was a unit which was established in the Vice Chancellor's office. Initially, it was called the Change Management Unit, and later it became known as the Department of Leadership and Transformation. So a lot of colleagues within the university thought that it was therefore the duty of that unit to do a curriculum decolonization. And from my experience, we discovered that that was a bit mistaken, in the sense that such a unit pitched at a higher level, like a vice chancellor's office, normally it does strategic rather than operational issues. And I'm not here reducing curriculum to an operational issue, but I think for practical reasons, it is done really at an operational level. So what happened in the experience which I have and in the university where I worked, this unit, which was new in the Vice Chancellor's office, it had to define how it was going to make sure that decolonization of the university takes place. In other words, the experience which I want to share is that in order to do decolonization of the curriculum, you need to first of all create a conducive environment for that change to take place. And how we tried to do it was by actually coming up with new instruments for change, such as an institutional transformation plan, one, and secondly, a change strategy. And this change strategy, which targets the broader issues like institutional culture change, the change of epistemologies, scholarship, and languages, including the change of curriculum, but also the change of staff and the student demographics, the change of governance and the leadership style, the change of systems and the policies, and the change, and they also contributed to how universities can have a better funding model. And that, to me, became very necessary, because it then became an instrument to create an enabling environment for other changes to take place. The second aspect of it, after we'd done those instruments for change, the second aspect of it was then how do you make sure that the university fraternity in its entirety buys into the change which is being spearheaded? Because that unit, which was in the Vice Chancellor's office, worked like a catalytic unit, one which catalyzes transformation across the institution. And the second aspect was then, how do you mobilize? Because this issue of decolonizing at many levels, it will need the buy-in of all the stakeholders of the university. And the specific issue which we're addressing today, which is the specific issue of the curriculum, from my experience, from the Vice Chancellor's office, from the rectorate, the issue was that we had to put pressure to the deans and the heads of departments to take leadership in the decolonization of the curriculum. And what does that mean for the deans to take leadership in the decolonization of the curriculum? Because they are not the ones who are actually teaching. They are actually leading at a particular level. What we expected them to do was actually to lead their departments and their faculties or colleges. In some universities is organized into colleges, others into faculties. And the way they lead is that they made sure that within the faculties or the colleges, there was development of curriculum transformation plans. And those curriculum transformation plans were supposed to be actually debated at a higher level, at a Senate level. So each dean comes with the curriculum transformation plan and is debated there. Input is put into that. And then from there, it still de-escalates, because the deans and the heads of departments, they also don't do curriculum as such. So the question of who does really the curriculum transformation, it fundamentally ended up boiling down to, it is actually the academics and the intellectuals who are specialized in the disciplines, who are supposed to actually do the actual decolonization of the curriculum. But again, the question which arose, and again a question which is also raised by Nguku wa Thiong'o, is the question of which academics and which intellectuals actually take the lead in the decolonization. It is not all of them. And this question of not all of them, Nguku wa Thiong'o puts it that there are two types of intellectuals. And these two types of intellectuals, they are those who have actually internalized the problems which have been imposed by the cognitive empire and the colonialism. And those ones, sometimes they are reluctant to do any change. So he then said they need to be a second type of intellectual and the academic, the one who is conscious about the problems of colonialism and the problems of the cognitive empire, and is actually in a process of self-introspection to the extent that they can see something wrong with the existing curriculum. And this issue of the decolonization of curriculum coming to the shoulders of us as academics, it becomes very easy to understand if you know, if you take into account that the curriculum which we are talking about, which is very problematic, is produced by us. And the one which will be decolonized must also be produced by us. And when I was working in the administration, I faced situations whereby I will be called into departments. I'm a historian by training. I'll be called into some departments like management sciences. And they were asking, can you actually inform us how to do the decolonization of the curriculum? And again, I came out clearly to say, not me, but it is the specialist in any discipline who can actually change the curriculum. In the narrow sense, I'm now going down to the bolts and the nuts of what needs to happen. And this actually, why we continuously talk about it, why we are not doing it. We need to actually be frank to ourselves. One of the major problems is that it is us who are a problem. It is not anybody else. So when we are addressing each other like this, we're addressing ourselves, not anyone else. There are so many universities on the African continent. Winston was talking about the issue of marginalization and misrecognition, whereby the people who are supposed to actually do the transformation marginalizes themselves and they misrecognize. They actually have a problematic consciousness, which makes them fail to actually change the curriculum. And this, again, needs to be approached in a very frank and a very honest way, in the sense that all of us were produced by these problematic universities which were trying to transform. And if we are aware of that, then it is important for us to be actually sincere that we might actually be the problem, not the solution to these issues. And this takes me to the second part of and the last part of my conversation with you. And this is the question of perhaps we are actually need to accept that we are actually implicated subjects, if we can use the words of Michael Rothbard's, the implicated subject. And what is the problem about implicated subjects? In other words, because we are part and parcel of the problem, we need really to interrogate, to be hard on ourselves. Let's not look as though the problem is outside ourselves. It is actually inside ourselves. I remember one colleague at the University of South Africa, when people were talking about roads must fall, he says, but what about the roads in your heart and your mind? That's what you need to deal with first before you deal with the statue outside. And this takes me to, if we are honest about this, it doesn't mean therefore we must not do anything. We need to then go on to outline some of the practical ways which every university at the moment is busy. Silence, decolonization in progress. In other words, they tell us that there is indeed decolonization taking place. But what type of decolonization are they doing? From my experience, when we pushed the deans and the heads of departments to lead into this issue of decolonizing the curriculum, what happened is that they then degenerated into compliance. And this compliance, I think somebody already spoke about the issue of neoliberal problem within universities. So the deans were coming just to comply. On the 20th, they said we must bring plans. So they brought some things which fundamentally were not changing anything in the true sense of the word. But in practical terms, what from my experience I've seen, there are people who are taking the approach of remove and replace. Like we will remove what we think is Eurocentric and replace with it with something maybe in Africa which is Afrocentric. And the question is, how adequate is that, or how useful is that? Does that actually advance the goal of decolonization in its deepest understanding? I don't think that actually advances anything. If anything, it might actually be revenge and actually repetition without change, because that's what colonialism did. It removed and replaced. And if we are removing and replace, we are actually doing the same problem. So what is to be done? The question is perhaps to develop a decolonial approach to this issue of the relation between what we want to change and the dominant knowledge which exists. I think already somebody quoting Chakrabarti, Dipesh Chakrabarti has already said that perhaps the problem of what we call Eurocentric knowledge is not that it is useless. It is useful but inadequate. And how do you deal with that? And I think we've already, some of the terminologies, because you need the concepts to do these things. Some of the terminologies which I heard here is already you must decanonize what has been canonized. Perhaps you must also diversify, and perhaps also you need to depatriarchize, bring the voices of those people who are not. And if it comes to theory, you deparochialize theory and expand the shoulders of the giants on which we stand. And that can take us also to other concepts which I think are useful when we're actually doing the decolonization on the ground, the shifting of the geography of knowledge, and in the Ngukian sense, the moving of the center. In other words, making sure that the world, Europe, has actually moved into the center of the world, but it is not the center of the world. In other words, it is an important province of the world, but there are other provinces of the world. And this issue of deprovincializing and re-provincializing, I think, becomes important in a practical sense. And I think colleagues have already spoken about the other move which we need to take is the move whereby, take for instance, in philosophy, where we have somebody like Hegel as one of the philosophers. Do we therefore move in a direction of saying we are no longer going to teach Hegel? I think the right position is really to put the canonical text and the canonical thinkers on trial rather than remove them, so that you actually, there's something good in them, there's something bad in them. Like in all other knowledges, even the knowledges from the global south, the epistemology of the global south, they have some positive and some negative aspects. So we need to open up to that. And then specifically from a social science and a humanities perspective, perhaps we need also to think about what is the problem with the critical theory which is dominant today. I think one of the issues which is coming out now and then is the issue of the normative foundation of that critical theory. That normally the theories which are formulated in one part of the geography of the world normally comes with the normative aspects of that world. Normative aspects such as salvation, civilization, progress, social evolution, development, emancipation. And if it is founded on that, the major problem is that therefore even things like enslavement, colonialism, if we are thinking in that linear way, they can appear as progress. And then the last part, the last point which I want to talk about is also the issue of that we must not worship the disciplines. Disciplines emerged in particular moments in human history to solve particular problems. And we must constantly rethink them for purposes of relevance, fitness for purpose, and also that we avoid this issue that we become subservient to disciplines to the extent that we become blind to human problems.
Can we conclude, perhaps?
Let me stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Ndlovu, for a provocative presentation. I'm sorry I had to stop it, but we need some time for discussion. So I would like to thank all of the presenters for excellent discussions that raised a number of different questions. And we've got around 25 minutes for discussion. You can put your hand up. We've got questions from the chat. So let's start the discussion. Okay, we've got one question from Jomil Christian Lisa and another one from Sagar Shah. Can you please can you?
Hello.
Jamil, yeah, okay.
Am I being heard clearly?
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Yes. Good morning. I think it's 3 a.m. here in the Philippines. My name is Jamil Christian Eliza. I'm an education student from the Philippines. So anyone can answer my question, and I would like to sum it up with 2 questions. First is, I believe that in creating a curriculum, I believe that it should be national, scientific, democratic, and mass-oriented. How can we create a decolonized curriculum playing Tilia with these 4 components? And second is, what do you think is the role of the local language, or shall I say, here in the Philippines, we have the Filipino language. What's the role of the local languages when it comes to creating a decolonized curriculum? That would be all. Thank you.
Any of the speakers would like to respond to that?
Sorry.
Okay, let's take a question also from Sagar Shah, and then we can respond to both of them. Yes, okay, go ahead, Sagar.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, very quickly, because you're lacking time. First thing is that how do we change their narrative and give transparency to the public on this United Nations push for the Green New Deal, which no one is talking about in my experience of the colonialism, the rape, the pillage, the deforestation of forests, of the coal amount required for wind turbines and solar panels. And I have not seen any people in the activist movements from the African, Indian, South American communities because they're always on the periphery, not even in the room. So how do we actually decolonize the green movements, which are not actually green, and they're laden in blood of Africans, Indians, South Americans? And the other question I wanted to ask is with regards to another very tenacious subject is the colonial tax that the EU has been collecting via France from Africa for the last 50 years. The EU is basically funded on the back of African slavery. Yet at the same time, the EU is saying that we are about democracy, we are about equality. Really? We all know what happened in Belgium, I think it was, where the African hands were being cut off. So really, let's start talking about this. Let's throw a spanner in the works, a wrench in the chain, and start talking about the difficult issues and actually bring the people from the global south not to be on the outside, but on the actual tables, and not to be henchmen of some Oxford University, but of their own indigenous sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps our participants, our speakers would like to respond to any of the...
Can I?
Okay, Winston. Yeah.
Question on the Philippines,
Okay.
if that's fine.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, basically, towards the end of my brief presentation, I made reference to a convivial scholarship. And the case for convivial scholarship is one informed by the universality of incompleteness, which also applies to the university, that although we at the university are currently at the center of decolonization, as Ndlovu and many of the speakers acknowledge, we may be part of the problem. So in that case, we reach out to others, call it stakeholders outside of the academy, who have suffered unduly from the hierarchies of credibility institutionalized by the one-dimensionalism that pursuing the illusion of completeness. And that basically means providing for local languages, providing for a more democratic, conversational, accommodating idea of knowledge production and traditions of knowledge making. Thank you.
Thank you. Winston, you wanted to respond?
I wanted to respond to the idea of activism in favor of the problems in nature. I think you are quite right. The idea of re-lexicalizing, or not just decolonizing, is to reclaim and to push back the marginalization in all the other spheres, so that there is space to dialogue on matters of interest. And one thing that we make very clear in the new book that we have just, that was released recently, the Routledge Handbook of Media and Communication, is the idea of lived experience, yeah? That if we have this transdisciplinary approach, it should be connected to problems within lived experience. And it's something that is echoed in Ngugi's approach, the global ethics, and also in Professor Nyamjo's call for conviviality. And I think this is very important, that when you start from problems, then you look for which disciplines. This echoes what Professor Sabelo Ndlovu was saying, that disciplines should not be limiting, disciplines should be enabling if they, for example, are problem-led rather than to start with the disciplines themselves. So it should be the problem, then you look for who can help to resolve the problem, which methods can help. And in chapter 19, we actually offer this transdisciplinary kind of perspective that directs on lived experience, including issues like the forest problems that my colleague has raised.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Winston. I will move to a question from UCU UAL. I'm sorry, I don't have a name, but the hand is up. Would you like to ask the question? Okay, hi.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I can't change the name on this Zoom. It's actually Rupert Waldron.
Okay.
Thank you. I think, yes, thank you to all the speakers, really important topic. And I think my question for speakers as a whole really is that a couple of people have rightly touched on the risk of capture by senior university managers and of a concept of decolonisation. So I'm wondering if that lies in part in a kind of partial symptom-oriented emphasis frequently in the concept of decoloniality. Maybe just the name, Achille Membe has suggested that, under which very contradictory positions can gather. And whether that risks attention away from the actual causes, which is potentially a deeper system of exploitation. So some speakers have mentioned neoliberalism, but obviously colonialism predating neoliberalism, perhaps we should be saying capitalism as a whole. Lyle mentioned Gagi Bhattacharya, so obviously very importantly a victimized trade unionist, but also a key scholar of the concept of racial capitalism. So then that makes me think this composite concept, racial capitalism, highlights that question. So is it possible to wage the essential struggle against the impacts in the present of historical colonialism without naming and analysing in detail and placing at the conceptual core the cause of those injustices in capitalism? Not just neoliberalism, but specifically capitalism, which is, you know, today we didn't hear a great deal about capitalism and its relation to colonization, and therefore whether this can bring about the greater solidarity that obviously Gargi Bhattacharya represents and that Lyle touched on.
Thank you. Before we go to answers, I will, for the reasons of equity, I will go through another question from the chat, and it is: decolonize the curriculum debates tend to respond to decolonizing universities and theoretical courses. Can we also think about our pedagogy in practice and a relationship to practical subjects? So perhaps our speakers would like to respond to those two questions.
I can respond. Yeah.
Thank you, Lyle.
I just wanted to actually respond to the previous question as well about the Green Movement, and maybe link it to the question on addressing racial capitalism. I think that definitely the question of the environment and the ways in which sort of corporations have caused environmental devastation, and that is part and parcel of capitalism itself, is that it has impact on nature, not only on humans. It doesn't only exploit humans, it also extracts resources from our environment. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about the importance of addressing environmental justice, I'm not sure the name of the speaker who they were. I was thinking of the ways in which actually corporate funding, I mean, in the context of the Netherlands, for example, Shell funds, or has been up until 2015, been funding museums within the museum plan, key museums such as the Van Gogh Museum, the Stedelijk Museum, and so on and so forth. Whilst these museums themselves have been within addressing questions around environmental justice through artworks, through I mean, particularly the Stedelijk, through artworks, or through inviting speakers and so on and so forth. So there's a clear contradiction here in which, of course, capitalism somehow is pervasive in that sense, that that the sustenance of these institutions is very much built on the extraction and the pollution of the natural environment. And specifically here, I'm thinking, for example, Shell was charged for, I mean, one of the causes of I think there was the pollution of the Niger Delta, which then ended up, which led to the killing of 9 activists who protested against Shell in Nigeria, I think. And I'm just thinking out loud here. So I'm addressing particularly the contradictions within which institutions seem to be able to actually use the language of environmental justice, decolonization, and so on and so forth. But when it actually comes to the funding structures and the grants, that, you know, still they rely on these sort of like, and eventually, of course, through green activism, this museum or the museum plan museums have ended up breaking their ties with Shell. But this is just one example. I mean, if you think also, for example, of many fossil fuel companies have been funding research within universities and have actually had sort of a very strong impact on the trajectory of research, precisely because it's corporately funded and so on and so forth. So I think one cannot really completely disregard the question of capitalism and how it links to the university, even if the university is supposed to be, and particularly in the UK, most universities are considered public universities, but still the pervasiveness of capitalism through through funding grants from corporate cultures, and in this case, I mean, fossil fuel funding, or in the case of the museum, Shell also. So these are really important contradictions to raise, definitely. And I think decolonization as a project within the university cannot dismiss that. And it actually is about really, first and foremost, rethinking the university, or reclaiming the decolonial university is also about sort of being clear about what sort of partnerships these universities have, and what sort of like, so thinking about ethical forms of partnerships that are extremely important as such. Not sure if I'm making sense, but I feel, what did I also want to mention? I think this somehow answers both questions, maybe. I will give the
I think it answers definitely well. I don't know, our last question, perhaps?
I have really a question. I have a question.
We've got first, I'm sorry, but we've got a question from Dixa Pagar and Jay Henriquez, and then a question from you. Can we?
Thank you.
Yeah, Dixa, can you?
Yes, I can go, but I think Jenny, is that how you pronounce your name? You wanted to go first, so you can go ahead. I'll give you my question.
Jenny.
Yeah, Jenny, you can go. You have my question, you can ask, but you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Jenny, can you hear? Okay, Dixa, then if Jenny cannot hear us, do you have a question or not?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So my question really is about decolonizing education in like India, in countries such as India, where the dominant culture tends to suppress like tribal and indigenous cultures. And the government is like creating residential schools for tribal students, where their epistemologies and their cultures and traditions are not taken into consideration, and they're forced to adapt to like the dominant culture. And tribal communities often also tend to be subaltern communities with very little political representation and agency. So my question, sorry? So my question really is, what can we do? Like, I think we need to shift the narrative from not only Western colonization, but also decolonizing from the dominant culture, and how we can do that within countries like India, where it's embroidered with like a lot of history of caste and class. And so, yeah, I'm wondering what we can do to tackle not replicating colonial structures within our indigenous communities in India.
Thank you, Dixa. Of course, this is a question about relations of power, I think. I don't know if Jenny wants to add her question, and then our speakers can answer both of them, can respond to both of them.
I think you mean me.
Yeah,
my name is Jackie, not Jenny.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, so my question was really because I was looking at decolonization of the curriculum, particularly as being a teacher. I was, as a British teacher here, we have a Kemi Badenoch, who's the British Conservative politician, who is a minister for women and equalities, who has said that she is warning against the decolonization of the school curriculum, because she says there is so much more to being a Black person than being oppressed and being a victim. So my question is, are we in danger of pushing the narrative of, or compounding this illusion of weakness and being a victim based on decolonization? Or is there some way we can counter this argument to say that there is more to being, to decolonization, the curriculum, than making the Black students appear weak or victims?
Thank you. Thank you. Our speakers, would any of your speakers would like to respond?
I will quickly say that I think there is a misunderstanding of what decoloniality is. If you take what has been said here, for example, the idea of incompleteness, embracing knowledge from other contexts as valid is actually a strength, is something that can enhance, it's something that can actually, it's the learning, it's what learning is about. So if you don't embrace, if you don't open up, if you are not convivial, as my colleagues were saying, then you are actually stopping the learning process. And in my approach, the idea of pluriverse, the idea of recognizing knowledge as valid and dealing with them respectively is something that can actually be a strength, is something that can enrich the classroom. So I think there is misunderstanding of what decoloniality is. It should not be threatening. It should be, of course, it's about reclaiming and pushing back, but it's also about putting possibilities and making education much more productive and avoiding the narrowness that and poverty that arises from singular approaches.
Thank you, Winston.
If I can come in.
Yes, of course.
Okay. I think, again, the other aspect of is that the decoloniality we're talking about already has got some resources which we can use to almost deal with so many of the issues which have been raised here. In terms of its units of analysis already, we have in decoloniality, the first unit being human itself. It needs to be attended to. The question of power, the question of knowledge, the question of nature, the question of gender and the spiritualities. Those are the units of analysis which I think they actually enable us to deal with a number of issues which have been raised here. But I wanted also to answer the question on India. This issue that perhaps when we're talking about decolonization, we're only focusing about Europe. I think the concept is put forward by Ngukwa Thiongo, the concept of moving the center. He actually says we're moving the center from Europe to other centers, but he also says we're moving from the bourgeois minority male dominance to the workers and the peasants. So the concepts really are very useful if you become careful in deploying them.
Thank you. So we've got a question from William, and then alongside it, I will start with a question from the chat. Decolonization goes with who should be decolonized, who is he, and for what purposes does she or he need to be decolonized? So this is from the chat, and William, can you ask your question to the speakers, please?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. As it has been said, I'm Mr. William, and I'm from a DRC. So my question is about, first of all, the topic of our webinar. So it is about decolonizing the curriculum. Which curriculum, how, and by whom?
Quite.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So my question, I have two questions. The first question is about the topic of the conference itself, tackling the issue of decolonizing the curriculum, tending to know which curriculum, how, and by whom. I think that these WH questions, which are, which, how, and by whom, maybe should be preceded by who exactly. Because when we are decolonizing, we should know, we should ask ourselves, who are we decolonizing? And for which purpose? who? So I wish I got the answer about who is being decolonized, and who has to, for whom this curriculum is, and so on. So the second question, if you allow, comes with the problem of knowing if we know who has to be decolonized. Now the question is does decolonization has to do with a race, a sex, a continent, schooled or intellectuals or non-intellectuals? So what that decolonization, is it related to any entity of the world which has been under, you know, with these problems of power, loss of humanity and so on? Who exactly? So that's really my question.
Thank you. We've got just 1 minute, so I don't know if any of the speakers would like to respond to the questions.
Rosa.
Yes.
I just wanted to kind of make a point, perhaps, which we never had a chance to kind of engage with, and that's making a distinction between decolonizing as a movement and decolonizing as a kind of discourse, because I think the two are not the same. And in a sense, I feel that the whole discourse of decolonizing, rather than the movement in itself, needs to be taken out of its different elements. So for us to really make sense of it, then we have to understand what academics are saying about decolonization, or what they feel is necessary as a task in terms of decolonizing. We would also, want to engage with students, practitioners, and the institution. But I think there is definitely a kind of a difference and a distinction which we haven't yet made between, decolonizing as a movement and decolonizing as a discourse that needs to be unpacked as such, which is a discourse. The other thing we haven't had a chance to engage with is to say that decolonizing the curriculum is a very, very old problem. It's not a recent problem. Yes, it was driven by a serious and really important student movement, and I think that's what revived the whole debate. But if you read the literature on decolonizing, it goes back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, having since independence, especially in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, intellectuals engaging with exactly these issues. So we shouldn't be fooled in thinking that we are engaging with a new and fresh topic. It is an ongoing, important intellectual task.
Thank you, Tariq. And Frances also in his presentation looked into that aspect, how the project is unfinished and it always has to change and shift. Well, we are a minute over, but I don't know if any one of the speakers would like to say something else?
Yes, if I can.
Yes, of course.
I think that question of saying who should be decolonized, I think there is a short answer to it. It is us as modern subjects. Both those who benefited from colonialism and those who were victims of colonialism, both of us, we have a problem. And then the issue of what entities, the problem with the decoloniality of the 21st century is a planetary issue. It's not really limited to particular geographies. It's that's why we are talking about it even both in Europe and also in global South. So those were my short responses to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lobu. Before we go, I don't think we have any more time for further questions. Thank you all for a wonderful discussion and also for wonderful presentations. There are lots of issues that we could have discussed. Some we managed to touch upon, others we did not. This is a huge issue. And perhaps we can have another webinar or a conference on that later on. But before we go, just to ask audiences, participants that wanted specific references to perhaps email directly the speakers and ask them for specific references. I think that's the easiest way to do that. And also, there was a request for people that cannot hear for captions. So we couldn't have them here in the presentation, but we are going to be looking into adding captions once we release the whole event. So this is it. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all the questions, but perhaps that's a chance for a second event. Thank you all very much. Thanks for participating. And good night to all.
Rosa, thank you so much for chairing. You've been a great host.
Thank you, Rosa.
An amazing event. So I was very glad to chair it. Thank you all. Thank you to the participants.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you so much, Rosa.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you to all the speakers.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Are there people still? Can we wait for a little bit?
I will be here, so I don't know if
Need these contacts from our speakers. It will help us really to build a network. Okay. Rosa?
Yes?
Can I have a small question to you, please?
To me? Okay.
Yeah,
Perhaps you should, yes, go ahead.
I honestly, I need to beg for your support so that we can get this list of these presenters, because actually this has been, it has been a factory of producing us, helping us out. Personally, I am in DRC where we have really little resources. And as you know, I am also a PhD candidate. From the time I have the opportunity of networking with these great people, I really, really appreciate. So this list of mail address, if we can have, so that also we can put some questions of clarity and sharing, that's really very, very wonderful.
I don't think this is a problem. Can you email me or send in the chat your email address, and then
Yes.
our speakers would have it, or I can send it to all speakers, and then I can email
Yes.
speakers, and then they can contact you. Would that be possible?
Very possible. Let me do
Okay.
it right away.
Yeah.
Nice to be Professor. Yes, here I am.
Okay,
So it has been a great opportunity. It has been really a great opportunity. I have learned a lot.
Thank you. So yeah. So it is bambootalk2013@gmail.com. Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you very much.
You're
All
welcome.
right. Okay.
There are still people who forgot. I think they're.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people still there.
Yeah. They're about
Have you done this before, Rosa? Like on these huge events, like chairing these huge events online?
No. I've been presenting in one, but I've not been chairing. That's the first one. Online is sort of tricky, isn't it? But it was okay.
I feel like I'm trying to focus on the discussion, the questions, and then what's happening in the chat. And I find that, and like with such numbers, in the classroom, you have a few number of students, like you could always manage both, but with such great numbers, it feels like.
Yeah. Well, we had Monica Ibrahim that, sort of digested some of the questions from the chat, although we didn't have time finally to ask most of them. It was packed. We had amazing presenters and not a lot of time. That could be a conference in its own right, in a way.
And I felt the questions also, the questions also were quite convoluted, right? So at some point I was like, okay, where's this going? Like I needed to just stop for a second and I think a couple of them. I really felt that this guy from the UCU.
Yes, yeah.
I saw where his question was coming from, but I thought that the response for that would be, of course, recognizing that the infrastructures of the institutions are built on, the backs of, a history of slavery and a history of colonialism. So there is definitely a racial capitalist dimension to it. I mean, but I tried to bring both the previous question on environmental justice with that one to say that, privatization, capitalism, they always somehow enter into the institution and will inevitably change the course of, the sort of research and the sort of questions that are being asked. And
Okay.
This is actually like a phenomena that I think, it's not specific to the UK. I think in the US, the situation is way worse. Yeah.
Oh, hi, Miriam. How are you?
I'm fine.
Bye. Bye,
Miriam. Bye.
Bye. You cannot imagine how. Yes.
So
very, yeah.
So from the administrator, we have. I think we should end it because we cannot go forever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
To say, I've seen the congratulations on the research project. It sounds wonderful. When do you start it? Sorry.
In May. So I haven't. Yeah.
Good luck with that, and let's communicate. Yes. Okay. Bye. Bye to everyone. Bye.